Okay, so this is part 5 in our series, Torah in the Ancient Israelite Context, which is derived from Dr. John Walton and J. Harvey Walton's The Lost World of the Torah. Basically, I'm teaching the concepts and the ideas of the book, adding in my own illustrations and examples to help make that work. So we've already talked about several important concepts, right, in the first 4 sections. This is part 3 of the book, but it's our 5th video. So we've talked about Torah being an ancient document and what that means. We had 2 videos where we talked about the difference between law in the modern world and law in the ancient world. And what they actually had was more akin to instruction that teaches wisdom than it is anything in the modern world having to do with legal codes. And then in the 4th part, we talked about the Torah as a suzerainty vassal treaty, as a treaty between God as the great king and Israel as the vassal, and what that impacts. And how that helps us understand the text. Now we're going to talk about another concept which is important for our understanding of what is going on in the Torah, what it is about and what it is meant to accomplish. And that is that holiness in the Torah is a status given by God to his people. In reality, this is a truism for the entirety of Scripture, of course. Holiness is always a status given by God. God is the one who declares someone holy. So, basing their understanding primarily on Leviticus 19 to 21, many readers assume that by keeping the law, Israel would therefore become holy. Many people today additionally think that holiness is another word for piety or morality, generally some derivation of both, and that therefore the law was intended to tell the Israelites what they ought to do in order to be pious or moral. And of course, I've seen this many times, people using the term holiness as a synonym. And again, there is some semantic overlap in these words as we understand them in English and how we use them. We often use holy as a synonym for pious. But in the text of Torah, that's not generally what the word means or how it is used. We're going to develop this idea as part of this section. So many today likewise think that we are to pursue holiness, the same piety and morality, by obeying the same rules in order to achieve holiness. This is mistaken and misses the point. Holiness is connected to the objective of the Torah, but the Torah does not consist of rules to be obeyed. Therefore, its objective is not achieved by obeying rules. Again, that was the previous section, right? And we'll continue to talk about that concept. They did not have a society where obeying rules and laws was part of their understanding. They had customs, they had traditions, those again, not rules, not laws, that's something different. And they had wisdom for judges to help people, and oracles and other things to help people figure out difficult situations. But they were not keeping rules in order to become holy. Therefore, of course, if they were not doing it, we shouldn't think that it's going to work for us, right? So it's common for people to believe that holiness is something that godly people should aspire to achieve as they attempt to imitate God. This concept is routinely drawn from Leviticus 19:22. Be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Careful attention to grammar, however, will show that God's people are not called to be holy. The verbal form is indicative, not imperative. You will be holy. God declares his people holy by election decree. It is a status that he gives, and it cannot be gained or lost by the Israelites' own efforts or failures. Now, again, this is touching on much larger issues about the call of Abraham, God's predestination. It becomes Calvinist conversation. There's a lot of different things to delve into here. But one thing that we ought to be able to understand without too much difficulty is that in the Scriptures, God chooses Israel. Not because of anything they have done. Again, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. It is God's election. It is God's choice right? I will harden whom, as Paul says in Romans, I will harden whom I harden. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. God is the one who chooses. God, therefore, is the one that confers holiness. Again, because it's not morality, it's something different. We're going to delve into what it actually is. And it makes an awful lot of sense when you look at the scriptures this way. But again, Leviticus 19:22, grammar can get us into trouble. Right? When we read a statement like, be holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy, and we take it as a command, as something that we need to do, an imperative. When in reality, it's God saying, no, I'm holy, therefore you're holy, because I chose you, right? Again, very different understanding, but it's scriptural, right? It's always grace, it's never works. Right? I just got done preaching on Easter, Ephesians 2:8 and 9. This has been true. God didn't change with the gospel in Jesus and suddenly get rid of works and put grace in. It was always grace. All right, sorry, got to get sidetracked there. Just got done preaching that, so it's right here. So holiness, as a term used in reference to Yahweh, describes the full constellation of all that is associated with him. Holiness includes objects like the ark, places, Mount Sinai, the temple, time, the Sabbath, land, a field or city devoted to God, and communities, the nation of Israel. So note that in each case, it is God who declares what is holy and what is not. Why is Mount Sinai holy? Why is the place where Jesus meets Moses holy ground? Because God has said so. Right? When he says, make these objects, do these things, he makes them holy. The ark, the altar, the priestly garments, all of these things, he makes them holy by designating them as being connected to him. Therefore, anything in that connection to God, which God chose, right? These are not, there's not a pattern here. These are in the sense that you could say, oh, I get why all these things are holy. God is the one that said, no, this is going to be holy, that's going to be holy. These people are holy. God makes the designation, and when they're connected to him, they become holy. So labeling something holy identifies it as one of the spheres of patronage that collectively define the God's identity. So once you've called something holy, you've connected it to God, right? And that helps us understand the God, right? That's true of Yahweh. It's true of all the ancient Near Eastern gods. They would have had this same idea that the things that are holy tell us something about the God. So here's two examples. Exodus 6:7. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. They are identified with God. They are therefore holy. 1 Kings 5:5. I intend therefore to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord told my father David when he said, your son whom I will put on the throne in your place will build the temple for my name. That's of course Solomon speaking, and he says that he will place, that God's name will be on the temple. So once the temple is built, the temple is holy, it's identified with God, and it tells the people something about God. So when a thing becomes holy, whether that thing is the abstract community of Israel or an object like the art or the sanctuary, it means that whatever that thing is or does in some ways identifies something about what God is or does. There's one more slide on this, and then I'll unpack it a little bit more. So in the ancient, I'll back it up. This is where I want to say that. So when something or someone is designated as holy, it tells us something about God, right? It tells us that God wants this thing to be holy and to serve this function and serve this purpose. And then you can extrapolate from that. Well, what does that tell me about God? It doesn't really tell me something about this person or this thing. It tells me something about God. I mean, this person and this thing I already can see. I can already touch and understand on its own level. But its status as holy tells us something about God. In the ancient Near East, people didn't aspire to imitate their gods, and the gods didn't expect their worshippers to imitate them. Because of Yahweh's role as their king, the Israelites would have aspired to emulate God's wisdom and justice, just as a vassal regent would aspire to emulate the wisdom and justice of the king. However, such emulation is not what holiness, which occurs primarily in the context of ritual literature, refers to. Ruling the vassal state with wisdom and justice is the means by which to retain Yahweh's favor and blessing. It's not the means by which Israel will achieve holiness. Now, this makes all the sense in the world when you look at Israel's history, right? Very up and down, very hot and cold as a people. Some generations doing quite well. Some generations are a disaster. The people remain holy throughout that. But they're not doing a great job with wisdom and justice, right? The prophets are ripping into them in different generations for how they treat the widows and the orphans and the foreigners, how their weights are corrupt, and it's just bad, right? So they certainly aren't achieving holiness because they were never supposed to. It's not the way this works. Again, how could they have ever achieved holiness on their own? They couldn't, right? Because all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. All our righteousness are as filthy rags, etc., right? We cannot please God. So it's foolish of us to think that the Israelites did that at any point. Instead, God designated them as holy. What they were charged with achieving and accomplishing are wisdom and justice. And they had a mixed reaction with that, right? Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But they were holy throughout because they had been chosen by God and his name was associated with them. His reputation was associated with them. So holiness is always descriptive of deity. Even when the referent of the adjective is something else, Israel. Holiness does not describe a property of Israel. It describes a property of Yahweh. In the ancient world, identifying an element as part of a divine constellation does not say anything about the element. It says something about the deity to whose constellation the element belongs. Saying that, for example, Aries is the god of war does not tell us anything about war. It tells us something about Aries. Again, we know what war is. We don't need to know that Aries is the god of war to tell us anything about war. We look around, right? War is here. It tells us something about Aries. It tells us something about the god. And so saying that Israel is holy tells us something about God. Saying the temple is holy tells us something about God. This is the slide I was looking for earlier when I paused. I was stealing my own thunder from this quote. So again, we are bringing all of these things together. The ark, the temple, the priesthood, Israel, the land, the mountain, right? The holy mountain, all of this stuff, and saying this is holy, and that tells us an awful lot about God, which of course is the whole point, right? Is for God to reveal himself, for God to be known, for people to be in relationship with God by knowing him, in part. Of course, you got to know God. I forgot to mention it earlier. Walton was talking about how in the ancient world, nobody aspired to be like their gods. We already knew that, right? Nobody wants to be like Zeus. Nobody's trying to say, well, Zeus does this, so therefore we should do that. They know that's ridiculous, right? Now, again, God is different in the sense that ultimately we need to be Christ-like. That's a further conversation here. But again, that's not about holiness. Once we have been made holy because the blood of the Lamb has washed us clean, because we're indwelt with the Holy Spirit, then we can seek Christ-likeness. We can be empowered to do so. And it's again, so sorry, trying to get too far afield into the New Testament there. When Yahweh brings the nation of Israel into his constellation by declaring it holy, he declares himself to all the observers to be the kind of God who would be patron to a nation like Israel. Which again is why how Israel behaves is important, because that reflects upon God. God, now again, the people around, the nations around, they don't know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They don't know him personally. They're not communing with him. His presence is not among them. So how will they know what God is like? Well, they'll look at his people and they'll say to themselves, that must be an interesting God because that's an interesting people, and they'll learn some things. Ezekiel 36:18-23. This is a long quote, I understand, but we're going to interact with it. It's an important text for understanding this. Excuse me. So I poured out my wrath on them because they had shed blood in the land and because they defiled it with their idols. I dispersed them among the nations, and they were scattered through the countries. I judged them according to their conduct and actions. And wherever they went among the nations, they profaned my holy name. For it was said of them, these are the Lord's people, and yet they had to leave his land. I had concern for my holy name, which the people of Israel profaned among the nations where they had gone. Pause there, okay? God explaining with the exile, explaining his judgment on his own people because they were profaning his name with their idolatry and their violence. And when they went out, the people said, they're God's people. Why is he kicking them out of the land? And they're putting two and two together and saying, now we understand why. Because look at them. Verse 22, therefore say to the Israelites, this is what the sovereign Lord says. It's not for your sake, people of Israel, that I'm going to do these things, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations where you've gone. I will show the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, the name you have profaned among them. Then the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the sovereign Lord, when I am proved holy through you before their eyes. Okay, so again, referring to Ezekiel 36:18-23, which we just read, and the restoration of Israel after the Babylonian exile. So here's the quote. Note that Yahweh's concern is for his holy name, that is his reputation, not for Israel's moral or social condition. Note also that the restoration is specifically for the sake of Yahweh's reputation and is not prompted by a desire to give anything to Israel. What is the number one need, the number one concern of God in this period in history? Making himself known, revealing himself through Israel so that the people may know. Why? Again, as I mentioned in the last part, because the Messiah is coming. Because he is preparing the world for his advent. And this people need to show the world this is the kind of God that the Messiah is representing. And so they need to behave a certain way. They need to act a certain way because they're reflecting God. It's about his name, his reputation. All right. Does God care about their moral and social condition? Yes. But that's after this, because this has to come first, because that is the greater need. All of Yahweh's interactions with Israel serve to establish his reputation one way or another. Yahweh establishes himself according to the principles of faithfulness, wisdom, order, and justice, as the ancient world understood these ideas, because those happen to be the highest values of the ancient world. The ancient understanding of order, justice, and faithfulness is circumscribed in the legal wisdom and treaty documents of the Torah. As we mentioned earlier in part 1, God revealed himself to Israel, to Abraham and his descendants, in ways that they could understand, using concepts, ideas that made sense to them, and in this case, using values that the people of the ancient Near East held dear. Right? The highest values of the ancient world were faithfulness, wisdom, order, justice, as they understood them. Again, not as we define them, but as they understood them. And so God establishes his reputation as being the best with respect to all those things through his interactions with Israel. However, we should not assume that Yahweh wishes to stamp an endorsement on these conceptions for all time. as if all people and in all places and at all times who serve Yahweh would be expected to reproduce the cultural values of the ancient Near East. And again, I've spent the last 2.5 years or so writing and researching and dealing with the First Fruits of Zion, which is a Hebrew roots movement organization, who are basically saying that exact same thing. That Torah reveals God's nature, and therefore it is for all people, all places, all times, will never change. And they're basically just stamping approval on ancient Near Eastern cultural values and saying these are the values for everyone everywhere. Now, again, they don't truly do that because they have changed and adapted, whether they admit that or not. But they're basically acting like Muslims. Many Muslims who say that Arab culture from the 7th, the 8th century is the ideal, and therefore that is what we should always maintain. That fundamentalist idea in Islam. They're doing the same thing. And saying that God is reflected in this code, therefore it can never change, it can never be challenged, it can never be set aside, and it will be for everybody everywhere all the time. Again, that makes no sense. It wouldn't have made any sense to the ancient Israelites. Again, they were shown these ideas by God because that's what they valued. It's not what we value. It's not what the people in Jesus' day valued. Not quite the same. They had some different ideas. All right. So likewise, we should not assume that we can substitute our own definitions for those words and claim that this is what Yahweh supports instead. So we've got two major pitfalls here, right? Number one is saying that ancient Near Eastern values, right, like the patriarchal ideas, their ideas about economics, their ideas about social class, any of those things, right? Slavery in particular, and saying, oh, God is putting a stamp of approval on slavery and on the subservience of women and on concubinage and all of these things and multiple wives. Is God putting a stamp of approval on these? No. He's working with the people as they were and elevating them from that spot, but he has to meet them where they are to do so. So it would be foolish of us just to set that in stone and say that is the way that God is for all times and places. But likewise, we would be fools if we just substituted our own definition of justice and order and wisdom and faithfulness, right? We define them our way in a postmodern, Western, individualistic, capitalistic, democratic kind of way, and read that into the text and say, well, that's what God wants. Because that's just our own morality and raising it up. That doesn't tell us anything about God. So we should understand Yahweh's self-revelation not in terms of absolutes or universals, but rather in terms of contrast. Faithfulness, order, and justice were not qualities that we normally associated with ancient Near Eastern gods. Pause. They were high values of that culture. But the gods that they worshipped rarely reflected them. Again, Zeus is an easy one to use an example because most Americans had to learn the Greek myths in high school. Zeus is not faithful. He's not just. He's a lech. He's a horrible man. Or horrible god. Sorry. Those are not qualities, right, that we associate with the Greek Parthenon, or Greek Pantheon, or with the Egyptian gods or the Babylonian gods. These gods are not good. They're the values of that society, but the gods do not reflect them. That's a sad state of affairs. Back in the quote, Yahweh has effectively told the Israelites that he is a different kind of God than their culture would lead them to expect of a deity. They have low expectations for the morality, for the character, for the nature of their gods. And Yahweh says, yeah, I'm different. Not only am I the actual God that actually exists, but I'm different. Right? I have qualities of love and mercy and compassion. I actually truly believe in faithfulness and order and justice and wisdom and all of these things. I embody these ideas. Because the purpose of Yahweh's self-revelation was not to enable the creation of theology textbooks, the details of Yahweh's character remain elusive. Israel was supposed to learn, and we can learn as well, that Israel's God cares about the human world, takes responsibility for his creatures, and is concerned for their well-being, and is not merely interested in exploiting them to gain some benefit for himself. So we learn about God through his actions, through the things he cares about, through the choices he makes, through the way he interacts with his people. Again, the Torah is not a theology textbook, just as Genesis 1 is not a scientific textbook. These are not, that's not why they were written. That's not the purpose they served. We learn theology about God through watching him, through seeing him, through what he says about himself, through how he interacts with his people. But the people also gained benefits in the form of God's blessing, favor, and especially presence. We'll talk about that more later, which were highly desired in the ancient world. Unlike their neighbors, the Israelites knew what they had to do to retain their God's favor. They had not reason to fear retribution for random or unknown offenses. And this is a common idea. It's at the heart of the Iliad. Right? The Greeks cannot sail to Troy because the gods are being capricious, and they seek an oracle. What do you actually want of us, right? And of course, Agamemnon ends up horrifically sacrificing his daughter Iphigenia to get the gods' blessings. It's insane. The Greeks were like, yeah, those are the gods. What can you do? So the Israelites had God's presence. And God explained to them, if you want my favor, if you want my blessings, X, Y, and Z, right? 1, 2, 3. These are the things to do. Those are the things to not do. And you'll gain benefits and blessings. You won't gain holiness. I already gave that to you. I chose to give that to you. But you will get blessings. You will get benefits. You will avoid punishments. And he laid that out for them. That was hugely important for them. So for Christians, this understanding helps us make sense of the incarnation, knowing that it is this God that is incarnate in Jesus of Nazareth, and not an ancient Near Eastern God, a Roman God, or an abstract philosophical God. In contrast, most people, most of the time, do not have these assurances about their gods, especially not in the ancient Near East, where the gods did not reveal their expectations and saw humanity only as a means to an end for serving themselves. Honestly, the gods in the ancient Near East are jerks. They are. Except for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they're jerks. They're selfish. They're vain. They're petty. All of those things. And so, by declaring the Israelites holy, right, and revealing himself through them, God is showing people that when the Messiah comes, it's this kind of God that you're dealing with. You can understand, he gives you expectations, he gives you blessings, and it's just such a great contrast. They knew so much more about what their God wanted, about what their God was like, because, of course, he had worked with them down through these generations and prepared them for this moment. So that's the end of this section. All right. So the number one takeaway, holiness is given by God, not earned by the people. And then, of course, that God is revealing himself to the world, right? To the Israelites first, but to their neighbors as well, by how he interacts with his people, by the mechanisms by which he gives blessings and curses, etc., etc. Because he wanted them to know, to understand, to be ready for the incarnation. All right, so that is the next section on holiness and and God conferring it on his people. Next, we are going to, in the next section, deal with what are those ancient Near Eastern rituals, and then what are the rituals in the Torah. We've got a couple of interesting sections coming up. I hope this is helping you understand. Again, ask questions in the comments. We can have a great dialogue about these concepts. And always, I will continue to recommend Dr. Walton's book. There's a lot of meat on this bone. I'm just simply doing my best to explain it in as concise a way as I can. So thanks, and God bless.